Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. Today's panel discussion is about security and vulnerability management, key trends. This panel is hosted by the Canada DevOps Community of Practice. We have many chapters here in the Canada DevOps Community of Practice, starting from Ottawa, Toronto, Edmonton, and Halifax. We cover Atlantic provinces as well. And we essentially bring topics which are from an overall perspective, land us into collaboration and creating that dialogue which is needed around these topics when it comes to security, vulnerability management. So by creating this dialogue on this topic, we will intend to discover new pathways, and we have our esteemed guests, which I would like to kind of take this opportunity that we should introduce ourselves. So why don't you start, Tracy, from you and let you introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks so much, Garima. Hey, everybody. My name is Tracy Miranda. I'm the head of open source at a company called ChainGuard, whose mission is to make the software lifecycle secure by default. And before ChainGuard, I was the executive director at the Continuous Delivery Foundation, which is an open source foundation dedicated to supporting projects like Jenkins, Spinnaker, and Tekton. And yeah, throughout my career, I've always loved and been involved with open source communities.
Thank you, Tracy. Why don't you go, Nikki, next?
Yeah, hello, I am Nikki Robinson. I am a security architect by day and a professor by night. I have a background in IT operations, so I came from the IT operations side into the security side of the house. I've conducted some research with my DSC in cybersecurity on vulnerability scoring and chaining, and then more recently with a PhD in human factors, studying the terminology and the way that we use language specifically in vulnerability management programs.
Great, thank you for being here. And Raji.
Hi. Hello everyone. So I'm Rajlakshmi Srinivasan. So I'm coming from Zoho Corp. Zoho has a suite of products, and we do have products in security and vulnerability management, the IT management suite. So I think I'll be able to discuss about that in the panel here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So we welcome all the DevOps community of practitioners to actually take part in this discussion and build a dialogue further. But let's get started. And in my mind, because I run this community of practice for several years, the first and foremost question which comes on the table is, what are the key ingredients of security culture? You know, and I would direct this question, Raji, first to you, because I think you have an extensive experience, you know, working together with products and services in the security space. And then we can explore further on this topic with open source mindset, that what is different when it comes to security culture and bringing that perspective as well. So over to you, Raji.
Yeah, thank you, Garima. Yeah, true. This culture plays a major role, particularly when we want to talk about the security culture itself. There are, I could think of quickly some 4 or 5 key factors that are important. And first one being employee awareness. How much are people aware of what is happening around them? Because we are talking about things in the cloud. So you have to be aware of what you are doing. So awareness is important. And once you are aware of, you should take the responsibility as well. So individual responsibility is what they are doing, because many of the security issues, or most of the security issues that we are facing, are due to manual errors. So you should be aware of what is happening, and you should be able to take responsibility of what you are doing. So that is also important. And then having some clear policies and process, and complying with all the standards that are there in the industry. And the management plays a major role. The top management's involvement and commitment in adhering to security policies, because it's not just that only the individuals, it has to be there in the blood of the organization itself, particularly those, not just the cloud, even the on-premise products, it is important. But if you are on the cloud, the data is, you are having customers' data, the ingredients for the security is crucial. All this evolved around the ethical philosophies of the organization itself, has to be kept in mind for long-term goals so that they can take care of it. So to put in a nutshell, the employee awareness and individuals' responsibilities with clear process, policy definition, and top management's involvement and commitment on keeping privacy security in the forefront will take this to a longer run.
Excellent. I think we'll come back to Nikki on this awareness and education part. Good that you mentioned that, but we take it with Tracy actually. How is it different in open source world? You know, building a security culture in open source world. I'm excited to kind of bring this forward and base this dialogue on this question, because I'm wondering that community of practice would be kind of benefited out of this dialogue, and many people might think that they are two different things. But Tracy, how do you see it?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think Raja Lakshmi made some great points. And yeah, pretty much security is everybody's job. And when it comes to open source, like the reality is that most modern architectures are building on lots and lots of open source, but sometimes the different, depending on which community it is, they may or may not have a strong posture when it comes to open source. Like one example I give, for a while I was leading a team at CloudBees, and that included the Jenkins project, and part of the team was the Jenkins security officer. And I had a firsthand view of just what was involved. So Jenkins as a project has been adopted really widely. So they see all sorts of things coming in, like people have used Jenkins to do Bitcoin mining. So if you have sort of unsecured servers. So the big challenge, I think, in the open source is, one, you've got all sorts of contributors with different experience levels, different abilities, but you still need a way to make sure they're coding, you know, with that responsibility and with that awareness. And then the other side of, if you do happen to have a vulnerability, how do you then go about identifying and responding to that? You know, it means you can't have people who are just doing this part-time or in the evenings. And then how do you communicate that to the entire industry? Like if you think of Log4j, how do we let people know, okay, you are using this and you need to take these steps to fix that? Because half the challenge is then just getting that message out and getting people to care that they need to deal with this, because like there's so many unpatched things out there. So definitely lots of challenges, but I think people are starting to appreciate that software security is open source security, and you can't separate those two things.
Right, very, very good points, Tracy and Raji. And it leads us to Nikki, because, you know, when the whole world is talking about community-led innovation and community-led software solutions, how do we build that perspective, you know, that security is the responsibility of everyone? What role the education institutes, you know, would play in this? I think to a larger extent, this culture needs awareness, education, as well as a different kind of mindset. So would you like to kind of reflect on those challenges and how these universities and educational institutes are tackling that challenge?
Yes, absolutely. So vulnerability management it's literally one of my favorite topics, because I don't think it's talked enough about in like considering undergraduate programs or things like that, like a cybersecurity program. There might be really good information on policies and security assessments and things like that, but there isn't always a vulnerability management component. You know, it might be, hey, patches or security assessments, this is how you handle things. But I think the sometimes the depth of understanding for vulnerability management, you know, sometimes it's seen as like patch management, but it's so much bigger than that. So I think, which sort of led me to some of my later studies on terminology and how we use terminology. So I think if we can come to a consensus on sort of what vulnerability management means, I think that can help a lot if we can define it and talk about the same thing at the same time. But as far as security culture and building upon that, I think if we can have sort of this integration vertically and horizontally in the organization, so that way, good example, you know, between operations and security teams, sometimes there's like a lack of awareness of, you know, what an operations team is doing day to day from the security team, and sort of vice versa. The operations team doesn't necessarily see what the security team is doing day to day. Even though they may be collaborating on things, they may not have that window or that view into each other. So I think building that security culture comes from building relationships between teams, whether that's development, operations, security, and beyond.
Right, and this sets the stage for the next question. What are the long-term benefits for bridging some of these gaps which we have discussed so far? Obviously, education awareness is being one of them. You know, products led with security as you know, a mindset is another one. And in my mind, I think open source community and the shifting the needle in the right direction from a security perspective can be one other point or one other key point. Obviously, we have other areas which we will reflect during the later questions, but I will target this question, Raji, to you. In terms of the products, you have, you know, from a Zoho Corp perspective, you have a large suite of products, right? So where do you see the long-term benefits if we start kind of bridging the gap and, you know, start to take those kind of advanced next steps in the process of managing next generation, you know, vulnerabilities and ensuring that we have that next generation mindset towards security?
Yeah, great. So with respect to long-term benefits, so I will say in one sentence as cybersecurity it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's not that you do something and it is over and you go and worry about something else. As long as you have your products, as long as you have your business, you have to continue to keep worrying about security and privacy and vulnerability aspects, particularly from a product perspective. Zoho being a cloud provider where we have everything software as a service, security plays a major role because customers' data is there stored in our cloud. So it's more of, it defines sustainability. So the cybersecurity is also defining your sustainability in the longer run, what you can do, and that comes with the management's vision. So we say that zero ads, privacy is important. That's a goal, or that's a statement that our CEO does. Possibly we may have to ignore certain things which might not bring benefit in the short term, but definitely in the longer term, for building brand image, brand reputation, and the trust that we are building in the customer's mindset, these play a lot. I mean, these play a large role in defining, because once you have that feeling that this is a secure company, customers are going to rely on you. So the longer run, these are intangible measures. You can't directly measure them. There could be some some shortfalls of taking this route, but that's what is going to fetch you in the longer run. So for a long-term benefits are mostly that comes from the trust, the reputation, the brand image, that obviously brings in a lot of customers, and that does have the long-term impact. So it's in one sentence, it's a marathon. If we continue to run it as long as we are in business.
And it is a difficult question when it is asked in the context of open source, right? I mean, I've been reading reports and, you know, following some discussions around zero-day vulnerability management from an open source perspective. And some of these kind of key initiatives which people have started looking at seriously. So Tracy, could you also reflect from an open source community background, how do you see that dialogue building up for the long-term benefits, and what is the open source community doing to ensure that, you know, we bridge the gap for security, for vulnerabilities in, you know, within a stipulated time frame?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of activity happening in this space, and like in some ways, last year we saw action from like the Biden administration with the executive order around cybersecurity, and one of the results from that, the papers published by NIST, I think just this month, around secure software development framework. And they put out all these recommendations for kind of mitigating the risk in this space. And if folks haven't seen that, I highly recommend it. But when it comes to open source, I think like one of the nice things about that paper, it was acknowledging the role open source plays and how important reusable software is, while at the same time, I think it's become key to everybody that folks need to work together. There is no one company or no one project that is going to solve this. So it is a case of all the different industries and the different projects all coming together to look at holistic solutions in this space. And I have to say, like some of the open source foundations, like the OpenSSF under the Linux Foundation, have been doing a good job at uniting some of those players and kicking off initiatives that help tackle these, whether it's through education or frameworks, or even some newer projects. Like one of the ones we're looking at the moment is something called Project SIGSTOR, which is around signing artifacts. And it looks like a lot of package managers, like the Ruby community, are looking to adopt that. And we're hoping a lot more like package communities take this more seriously and have the tools which just make it easier for them to implement things like artifact signing with SIGSTOR.
Great, we'll come back to that point, Tracy, in a while, but it leads us to the next question on the panel. What industry research is pointing to? And you rightly mentioned some of these key initiatives like Open Security Framework, the OpenSSF, which is an initiative of Linux Foundation. I also see that there is a potential of, consolidating the landscape of security tools and how all these frameworks will be kind of onboarded or adopted in the longer run. But this question about the industry research, I think it's apt for Nikki to answer and reflect upon that, what do you see from the researchers, how they are reacting to all this and what we could see in, let's say, next 5 years?
Yeah, it's a big question, but I will say, when Tracy mentioned some of the work that's going on at NIST, I think they really are hitting on a lot of sort of the needs and what we've sort of been seeing in the industry. So I echo that. I definitely recommend checking out their latest documentation. So from a researcher standpoint, it's funny because, I've been in technology for about 14 years now. And I feel like we're getting to a place where we have some of the technology, we have some of the tools, and especially open source has really enabled so many different projects to sort of move forward and evolve the way that we develop and actually build applications. I think from a research perspective, and I'm a little biased because I was studying human factors, but I'm really encouraged by the research that I see with the integration of human factors and understanding how people are actually using the technology, how they're developing the technology to help enhance what we're already doing. So some of that is integrating behavioral analysis techniques. So what kind of habits do our developers have? What kind of habits do our security people have? How do you build upon that? How do you help them sort of do even better than they're already doing? So I'm really interested in the human element of this, because I think if we can understand sort of how our developers are working together, what sort of education they've had or what they have available to them, that I think that it can certainly help push this forward, because right as Rajay said up front, like the actual awareness of sort of what is possible, whether it's vulnerabilities or, best development practices, things like that. I think that's sort of what we need is some industry standardization. And that's sort of where I see like the forward leaning research going.
Excellent. And I think there is more to what you have said, because I see that there is a lot of, from a community perspective, when I, see the changes, how people are reacting to emerging technologies, it is concerning me at this point in time, because, I have extensively worked with software, solutioning, and there is a stage where we actually assess the maturity curve of these emerging technologies, or cutting edge or bleeding edge technologies, right? But I see a shift from a community perspective, that we are leading innovation in a way that everything is becoming a reality. And it also is concerning in a way that our security solutions and our security landscape is not mature enough to handle that emerging need. So I definitely feel that there is a big gap, and research organizations can be very, very helpful in actually bridging that gap. And one of the points which I think Tracy mentioned, which leads us to the next question: what are the key components of modern day security and vulnerability management? And I would start this discussion with what Tracy, you mentioned, with what you do at ChainGuard. So can you actually elaborate, how did it, your interest got into it, and you kind of, started to look at this as one of the key areas to work when it comes to security?
Yeah, no, happy to talk more about that. And I think, like, with my background in open source in Jenkins, you kind of have this greater and greater realization that there is so much to do. And sometimes if you step back, it can be pretty terrifying, especially when you're hearing things like Log4j and kind of other projects, and like the Sunburst hack with SolarWinds as well. I think one of the positive things is it now seems that with people focused on this area, adoption will be quick. And if everybody pulls together in the same direction, we can see some things progress in the right way. So a couple of things, like I said, Project SigStore is one open source project that is being set up in a way that people can adopt it, so developers can drive that adoption. And from a ChainGuard perspective, one of the things we are trying to answer is, how do organizations get that visibility into what they're actually running? And how do they then, if they establish their policies, how do they then roll them out? And how do they move teams in the right direction? But bear in mind, like the human aspects, like Nikki was referring to, like not all teams are going to move in the same state. They're not all going to have the same risk profile. So how do you help them? How do you provide the right level of automation, which has to combine with organizations to be able to do that? So we're starting to look at potential solutions in that space, and what we can do automating that, especially when it comes to kind of distributed systems like Kubernetes. But yeah, early days still.
Yeah, we love to hear more from you, Tracy, on that part. But let's move the needle to Raji in this case. And I would like to kind of also understand from you, when we talk about products in the cloud space, what are your key priorities, and what are the key components you would like to constantly invest in, and how do you actually see the practical steps of implementing those best practices, or call it like security practices, within your organization?
Great. So the best practices are when you are developing a product, what are the things that you have to take care? The first thing is zero trust. Never trust. Verify at every stage, whatever it is, be it at the design or at the before you deploy the build, or when you're doing any testing. At all layers, bring a strong identity management. It is nothing to do with the employee trust per se, but when you're in a cloud space, when you're working with products, absolutely everything has to be audited, and you have to have evidence. So zero trust is something that has to be done, the DevOps chain itself. And when you talk about the IAM, the identity and access management that you have to have for your products, the goal has to be how you are able to give the right people the right access to the right resources in the right context, and all of them to be audited and monitored continuously. You should not be giving unnecessary access to wherever it is not required. So give only relevant authentications and relevant access wherever required. And you can also add on top of it. We have to add for the product, even for our own employees who are accessing the product, or if you're building a product and giving it to customers too, you should be able to add two-factor authentication or a multi-factor authentication, and include all levels for the production data and application at all layers. So when we talk about DevOps, there are different layers. We handle the data layer, we handle the application layer, we handle the platform layer, we handle the infrastructure layer. At each of these layers, the security aspects can be taken care of. At the data layer, how do you classify the data? How do you make sure that you encrypt the data? You have to take care of backup and the secure disposal at the data layer. And when you move to the application layer, web application firewalls and data isolation from one user to another, and building IAM, those are some things that have to be included. At the platform layer, how are you able to do secure configurations at each of the inter-service communications? So that those things are important. At the infrastructure layer, your physical security, your OS hardening, DDoS prevention. So each layer has its own security things to be taken care of. That's why I said it's not just something to be done after the product is developed. So throughout the life cycle, you have to take care of everything. That's how you will be able to implement. That's how we are implementing in DevOps area and the steps that we take during our product development.
Excellent insights, Raji. And I think you touched base upon a very critical aspect of security and vulnerability management, which I am seeing that from leadership perspective, it is becoming a top topic on the agenda. That's data security, data protection. And I would like to understand, Nikki, from your perspective, when we talk about data protection and vulnerability management in the context of data, how huge that opportunity is, and are we acting according to what we see happening out there? There is a lot of action happening with data at the core, right? So there's a lot of emerging technologies using that data to incentivize, monetize, or even revolutionize the change which is happening. So how do you see in the context of data security, or if I'm allowed to say data SecOps?
Yeah, so I love that term. I think it's a lot of what we've seen with DevOps, right? Like, it was this idea that it really helped push like agile practices and developing faster, identifying problems, things like that faster. It's sort of the same thing with data, right? It's like we're now seeing this sort of shift from just talking about security to talking about privacy too, and talking about them in the same sentence. And so I think when it comes to data, we're not talking about databases anymore. We're talking about data lakes. We're talking about massive quantities of data that one, need to be analyzed, but two, need to be stored safely and securely and somewhere where we have access, but the proper access, as Raji mentioned, IAM practices, it all relates to the data that we are consuming and using and storing. So I think as the amount of data grows that we're, constantly building upon, whether it's data from customers, that we have to make sure that we're protecting appropriately. I think there's a lot more laws and regulations that are going to be coming out, probably related to data specifically and privacy, that we're just going to have to sort of adhere to. And I think globally, right, that conversation seems to be changing. So I think there's a lot of unknowns at this point, but I do hope that there is more conversation around it, and including security in the conversation, regardless of the context, right? Like if I'm talking about data or, a database or a data lake, how do I secure my data lake? I was talking about securing MySQL databases. So So yeah, so I think that conversation is just sort of shifting.
Right. And now we come to the last question of this panel, and I would like to start from Tracy. And, we have been discussing about data, and you operate in that space today where you are doing a lot of initiatives in and around, artifacts. And in one way, it is channelizing some of these, key initiatives in that area. So I would like to kind of have you from your perspective, what is that North Star we are heading towards when it comes to security and vulnerability management, keeping in the context of what we have discussed about DevOps, DataSecOps, data, and also the next generation software solutions?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of different directions. So I referred to that NIST paper earlier, and I think that's a good example of a framework people can start to use to head in the right direction. And it breaks it down into sort of 4 areas. It talks about protect the organization, protect the software, produce secure software, and be responsive to vulnerabilities. So I think the problem is when you break each one of those down, there's lots and lots and lots of things you have to get right and do, some of which are easy today, and some of which, take something like a software bill of materials, isn't that straightforward yet. But one of the frameworks that we have seen that's starting to resonate with folks is one called SLSA. It's slsa.dev. And it provides, it looks at one aspect and it sort of breaks it down into sort of 4 levels, kind of like a maturity level, but more like here's what you need to do at these different levels. And we're starting to see more organizations, particularly financial ones, even look at these and set them as OKRs of saying, okay, by the end of the year, we want to be SLSA level 2 compliant. And these are the things we need to do with our builds, with our vulnerability procedures and things like that. So that's probably one of the early initiatives I'm seeing that's starting to really resonate with people and just give them a way to carve out a space and tackle things in a practical way. It's a really nice framework that supports that.
Thank you, Tracy. And Raji, we would love to hear from you, from a product-oriented mindset. Where do you see we are heading towards, and what is that one advice you can give to the community of practitioners here?
Okay. So as I was saying earlier, I would stress on the same things. Adopt zero trust, build a strong identity management, build at all layers, because a problem anywhere could lead to, it's a weakest link. Security is the weakest link in the chain, right? So even a small leak in one place could have a great impact. And it's important to understand shared responsibility too. Even though you are taking care of everything perfectly, your customer is not aware of and sharing the credentials, it's going to be at loss. So you have to know what is your responsibility, what are the customer's responsibility, and understanding, because a lot of integrations, it's not one tool or it's not one thing that people are using. So the shared responsibility has to be understood. A lot of time it will be like, it's not my game, I'm only using it, so I don't know how it is. That's a mindset. And definitely it's a cultural mindset shift that has to happen. And because everyone has to feel that they are responsible for what they are doing. So that cultural mindset shift has to happen for it to see success in the longer run.
Right. Thank you, Raji. And I would like to end this panel discussion with Nikki. We have touched base upon a lot of aspects, the technical aspects of, security and, the key issues with vulnerability management. I would like to kind of also understand from you that, do you see an economic advantage in terms of, moving forward with a strong focus on how we would ensure our software solutions would be secure, safe, and free from vulnerabilities? Is there an economic landscape for this? Like, is it something which we can kind of bring into this conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think one of the things we sort of touched on earlier was sort of bringing people back into this conversation. And yes, I agree. I think there's a huge space for this, because I think sort of DevSecOps and DataSecOps, a lot of this stuff is still pretty new. So there's a lot that we can build on to help sort of mature what we've already got going on. So yeah, so I think there's a huge advantage to simply going out there. Like, there is a ton of great information that's already open source and available for people to go out and sort of digest. But I think there's still, and I'm biased because I'm a researcher, but I think there's a lot more academic research that needs to be done in partnership with open source communities, and helping to develop some of those maturity models or frameworks or taxonomies, things that will actually help sort of move that needle. So yeah, so I think there's a lot more integration that can happen between academia and open source software.
Thank you very much. And thank you for actually being here and talking about this key topic, security and vulnerability management. I hope that many community of practitioners would be benefited out of this discussion. I would like to kind of personally thank all of you for being here and trying to kind of help us understand where we are going with security, and how DevSecOps and DataSecOps plays a key role in making all these solutions and software solutions happen. So thank you for your presence today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be part of the panel. Thanks.